Hello, this is Dr. Barry Leica. I'm host on Webtalk Radio on Inside Cosmetic Surgery Today. This is your radio show that puts your pulse on the inside features of cosmetic surgery. The facts, the leaders, the people that know exactly what's happening so you can get the real truth about what's happening. And today, we're graced by the presence of a wonderful dermatologist, a full professor at the University of Minnesota by the name of Charles Crutchfield. Charles is a personal friend that I've known for about 15 years, but what makes Charles so amazing is he is one of the leaders in cosmetic surgery. He's what I call a fast uptaker, and he has been on to most of the amazing trends that go on, but at the same time, he's steered clear of almost every trend that hasn't made it. So that's why I think Charles' opinion is one that really should be listened to, and Charles has been amazing with all this. So I'm just going to talk to Charles today about a new technique called liposculpting. It's also known as Coolsculpting, which is a new way, the newest thing that's hitting the press these days. It's on the cover of Vogue. It's in all the magazines. It seems to be taking all of North America by storm. Whether it's the cat's meow or not is left to be seen. But I think Charles is the one that can help put us straight on this information and get to it. Charles, how are you today?
Fine, thank you, and thank you for inviting me on the show, and it's good to talk to you again, and thank you so much.
You know, it's always my pleasure to have you as a guest, Charles, and it's always so nice to talk to you. Tell me, you know, we hear a lot of hype about all sorts of procedures every day in this business, and we're always being talked to by people about new procedures. Tell me about this Coolsculpting. Is it really something people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, you know, every once in a while, I remember when I was in graduate school, one of my mentors told me, he said, you know, Charles, every once in a while in life you stumble over the truth. Unfortunately, most people pick themselves up and keep on going. And that's exactly what this is about. It's one of the few things that's come along that really, really meets the hype. It's something that works very well. It's not a substitute for liposuction or anything like that. It's for people that have a few bulges that want to sculpt down and smooth down. The success rate is about 80%, and it actually comes, and I talk about tripping over the truth and picking yourself back up. It comes from a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine many years ago that talked about these little children that ate those popsicles, you know, the wooden sticks, and you break them in half, and you give each kid a half of the popsicle.
Yeah, I sure do. That always gave me brain freeze when I got that as a kid.
You would get brain freeze, but the little kids that would eat them constantly and keep the tip of the popsicle against their cheek, that coldness over time would cause an atrophy of the fat or a dimpling. So these little kids would get dimples in their cheeks, and they called it fat atrophy or cryolipolysis. And so they published this thing in the New England Journal, and it was an interesting little finding they saw in these kids, but no one made the connection until years later. Somebody read the article and said, whoa, if you actually freeze fat, it melts away and thins away. Let's develop a machine that's kind of like a little portable refrigerator that you can set on areas of unwanted fat, tummy, love handles, upper bra fat on the back, and see if we can melt it away. And that's where it came from.
Well, tell me, Charles, you know, you and I are no stranger to the cold. Both of us live in pretty cold climates at least part of the year.
That's right.
How do you prevent the frostbite from occurring? I mean, you know, when cold gets on the skin, it doesn't only freeze the fat, it freezes the skin.
Well, part of it has to do with the technology of the machine that actually chills the skin down. But there's a specially patented developed pad that you put on top of the skin, and then you put the machine on, because I've been asked that many times. Why can't I just get some ice cubes and hold it on my stomach, or why can't I get some dry ice or liquid nitrogen and spray it on there? You're right. The epidermis gets too cold, and you get blistering and frostbite. That's the problem. And so that's the technology they developed with this machine to get around that.
Now, my understanding of this machine is it's rather unique. It just doesn't freeze it, but it actually draws the heat from the area. Is that correct?
It does two things. It draws the heat. It also chills it down to just above freezing, but it also vacuums it up and puts it into a special chamber so you can get a nice, cool, even cooling effect. And that's another thing that makes it work so well. The disadvantage with it is you have to have a special unit for every area that you're treating. So you'll need a special handle to treat the abdomen, a different one to treat the love handles, and a different one to treat the upper back fat.
Now, these pads come in different sizes, I understand, for the different size of the area that they're treating.
And so right now, those are the areas that are most amenable to treatment. In the future, they're still working on developing different techniques to treat under the chin and also on the backs of the arms and the thighs, inner and outer thighs.
Now, you and I are no strangers to the fact that we could treat fat not only with surgery, and I've done surgery for a long time for it. Liposuction has been something that I realize that I've been doing now since 1986, so 25 years in the saddle of doing it.
Well, you're one of the most experienced liposuction physicians probably in the world.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the people that train me are no longer doing it. Mm-hmm. I just was talking to one of my mentors and teachers in the last little while, Patrick Lillis from Woodland, Colorado, who had done an amazing 8,000 cases in his lifetime, and he's no longer doing it. So many of the old boys, many of the guys that I consider to be gurus in the field are no longer partaking in it.
Well,
part of it is because of wear and tear. Part of it is because of boredom. You know, there's nothing more boring than doing 8,000 cases of liposuction unless it's maybe 8,000 cases of hair transplantation. But the point is that many people are trying to offer more to patients, and surgery certainly is not for everybody. Is that not right, Charles?
That's absolutely. But once again, and I tell patients, this is not a substitute for surgery or liposuction. This is a complement to it. Be it
and I think the first question that should be asked to anybody is would you consider going for surgery? And if the answer is yes, then I think this is something that should be put on the shelf. But if the answer is no, I wouldn't consider it for all the tea in China, then I think people have to look at this as a viable alternative.
Yep, and I tell patients, too, it's not a substitute for exercise or eating healthy or even general weight loss. It's really a sculpting effect, a smoothing and a sculpting. You should notice a 20% reduction in that area of unwanted adipose or fat tissue, and probably a couple inches off.
Are there any diets that help make this work better?
You know, they're looking at that, but there's none that have come to the forefront at this time.
Okay. Now, the idea of fat being a target, now fat is a very interesting substance. We all know that there are people that have a propensity to put fat on no matter what. You know, they can eat their proverbial spinach salads every day for the rest of their life, and they still tend to put on fat. Whereas other people, they can eat huge amounts of calories and not put on a single amount of it. Now, I always find it interesting that people tend to put it on certain areas. There's almost a propensity for that. Is that not right, Charles?
That's exactly, and that's the patient that I see all the time. I mean, I saw a patient the other day. She runs marathons. She runs 8 to 10 miles a day and runs marathons, and she still has that little tummy bulge that she got after pregnancies. And my father's an obstetrician gynecologist. I remember a few years ago he called and said, "Son, do you have anything to get rid of this little tummy bulge, tummy fat that women get after they have a baby, and they do sit-ups and they exercise and they're in great shape, their BMIs are fine, but they've got this little bulge?" I said, "Dad, we do this all the time." And it really is genetic. You're right. There's just certain areas where the fat goes on, and no matter what you do, it stays on. And
well, I think that comes down to when we used to be cavemen living maybe several thousand years ago, and we never knew when a water buffalo would come along as our next meal, and we needed to put calories away quickly. So those that survived were people that had a propensity for putting it on in certain areas very quickly.
Or just like the double humps on a camel, just you keep it for when you need it.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this genetic advantage to putting on fat, but now we don't go through periods of feast and famine anymore. We simply go through periods of feasting.
But our genes are still turned on to protect us.
Yeah, and that's the downside of it.
You're fighting genetics.
Yeah, that you know, a large part of what we're doing day in and day out is fighting genetics. And the good news is we can fight it now. The good news, we don't have to live with what we don't want.
I got a call from a reporter about a year ago from Chicago. They're doing a story in the paper, and they asked, why do you think people are doing so many cosmetic procedures now, cosmetic medical procedures? And I said, the answer is easy. We have things that now work. Yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, not only do they work, but, you know, we've had means of doing liposuction since probably the 1920s. But, boy, were they dangerous. You know, it was a life-threatening procedure to get liposuction done back then. In fact, the first procedure that ever was done was on the leg of a ballerina, and she ended up getting an amputation from the massive infection that came out.
Wow.
So that was way back when, and thank goodness now liposuction is done so safely. It's done amazingly when it's done in the proper hands. But again, it's not for everybody. And let's go into this procedure of cryolipolysis a little bit more, Charles. Tell me, who's the ideal candidate for this?
I think the ideal candidate for Coolsculpting, or even lipodissolve, and we might talk about that later, is the patient who's in good shape, who has a spot or spots of unwanted fat or adipose tissue that they could point to and say, I want this little bulge to disappear. The patient is generally overweight. It's not a good substitute. It's not a substitute for lack of exercise or eating healthy. It's a patient that's got that little tummy pouch or love handles or that little pad of fat that protrudes above and below their bra. So when they wear a tight shirt, they feel self-conscious. Those are the patients that it's ideal for.
Okay. So a person comes in to see you, Charles, and you've determined that there's how long is a procedure like this going to take?
The procedure itself takes 1 hour. The cooling device is very cold, and about the first 6 or 7 minutes it's very, very cold to the point where it's almost uncomfortable. But all of a sudden, at about that 7-minute mark, there's complete anesthesia and there's no more discomfort. So most patients sit back, they either take a nap, they'll surf the internet, they'll read a book, read a magazine. We have portable DVD players, they'll watch a movie. So it's a 1-hour procedure.
Excellent. Now, let's talk about the nasty downside of this, because, every procedure has an upside, but there's always a small group of people that have some side effects. Tell me about the nasty side effects that a person might experience with this.
Well, the key is to make sure that you are doing it with somebody that has a lot of experience, because you have to have the proper and exact placement of the cooling pad. Otherwise, you're going to get frostbite and ulceration and all kinds of complications. So that's number one.
Essential, and that's true of any cosmetic procedure. If you're not going to an expert, you're a fool.
That's right. The second thing that I've noticed, sometimes there's this paradoxical reaction that right after the treatment, when the skin rewarms, there's this intense tingling. It's almost like when your leg falls asleep and it wakes up again. So there's this tingling that can last anywhere from about 5 to 15 minutes. And if you're not told about this ahead of time, you can almost panic because it's so intense.
Is that like a pins and needles sensation? Or is it...
Exactly. It's almost like a tightening in a pins and needles. This happens about 2% of cases. And for patients who don't know about it, you think, oh, my gosh, this is awful. But all of a sudden, by minute 15, it completely goes away.
Well, one of the patients I saw it done, and before they even did the full procedure, they did a mini procedure on the person. And right away, the skin became rock hard. Is that usual?
Yeah, it gets pretty cold. I would say it's not exactly rock hard, but it's pretty firm.
Yeah, it's firm, and the person gets this aha experience and says, wow, that's actually happening. There's something happening here.
They do. And I think, like with all procedures, it's great to have a full discussion and patients that are informed, and they know what's happening, because then when it happens, they say, oh, I know this is going to happen. I expect this to happen. The other thing that I've seen is in about 2% of patients, they can have a persistent, mild discomfort in the area of treatment that can last a couple weeks. They say it just feels like tender or sore, like you've worked out for a while and your muscles ache, the next day. But this goes on for a couple weeks. It's rare. It always disappears. But it's good to let the patients know. So if it does happen, they know that it's not anything.
And what about persistent edema? Does that sometimes happen, swelling in the area?
It's been reported, but we've probably done now a couple hundred cases, and I have not seen that.
Interesting. Okay. Because, when you get frostbite, one of the most phenomenal thing that happens afterward is after that area unthaws, it becomes very painful and becomes very edematous for a long time.
But no, that's something I just don't see. And I think it probably has to do with the technology in the device.
Okay. Now, when I first saw this 4 or 5 years ago, the protocols weren't too good. There was some results, but now I understand the protocols have advanced quite a bit and people are getting better results. Is that not correct?
Yes, it's almost automatic now. They've worked out all the parameters and the settings, and it's basically proper placement, and the device takes over from there.
Okay, so let's go into somebody's interested. How much is this going to cost them, Charles?
I tell patients when it does work, and it works 80 to 90% of the time, I would say that the vast majority of patients, 75%, or 3 out of 4, will require just one treatment. 25% of patients will do a second treatment 2 or